I'm going to give you two sets of 5 words, and you're going to tell me which one you associate more with Christianity and the Christian God. First set: love, beauty, relationships, nurturing, feelings. Or the second set, which is competition, success, power, skills, and self-sufficiency. Pause the video if you need to. 90% of people associate Jesus more with the former than the latter. The former are words that describe that which come more naturally to girls, and the latter, boys. According to the book Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. Which one of these is the correct answer? Neither of them, really. That was just to prove that when thinking about Christianity, most associate it with traits that come more naturally to females. This partly explains why Christianity is made up of 61% women in the USA, whereas every other religion doesn't see this gap. In media as well, Christianity is seen as a more soft and effeminate religion. To give one relevant example, take the anime Vinland Saga. Vinland Saga is an amazing anime. The anime is a tale about Vikings going from land to land, stealing goods, conquering lands, and doing archetypical Viking things. One of the characters, Thorkel, is the quintessential icon of an 11th century Viking, sporting large muscles, Viking attire, and a whimsical conquest attitude, always eager to fight. In the episode he's introduced, he's seen fighting with no weapons, losing a part of 2 of his fingers, and shows no sign of pain or struggle. Fast forward a few episodes, and his band comments on how weak and soft Jesus looked on the cross. They were bantering around the prince, who was a Christian. They talk about how hard it must be being a Christian, and they comment on how easily Thorkel looks like he could knock out Jesus. To add on to this, the pious prince of the nation always had his face covered. Once his face is revealed, he's shown to be effeminate. He had long, smooth, blonde hair, large blue eyes, and a soft voice. Once the prince grows and matures, becoming more effective, confident, and assured, he becomes explicitly less Christian. Despite this being a Japanese cartoon, away from where I live, it does go to show how Christianity is seen as both morally soft and a physically soft religion. Even if you can argue that in the context of this anime, it may make sense being a gory show about savage Vikings, I'll soon explain that it still doesn't have to be this way. But I mean, Thorkel and their band aren't alone in this idea. Many notable figures, even famous philosophers, have echoed this idea. Most notably the 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche. He even went as far as to call Christianity self-mutilation. He said, "The Christian faith is from the beginning a sacrifice of all freedom, all pride, all self-confidence of the spirit, and at the same time enslavement and self-mockery, self-mutilation." Furthermore, Nietzsche believed Christianity to consist of what he dubs slave morality and master morality. Sitting at the top of society were the masters, who assert their will on the world, exercising strength and glorified their strength. At the bottom were the slaves, the timid, spineless, and pacified people who had been emasculated by their master into not being able to assert their will. They cope with this by asserting that they are actually more righteous and virtuous for being weak and submissive. They're unable to get respect, so instead of demanding respect and justice, they say they're practicing forgiveness. Instead of acquiring wealth, they condemn it and say that's greed. Seeking glory and fame is now narcissism. Being oppressed is now being obedient. Being strong and taking what you want is now called wrath, etc. The moral slave will not take command for this very reason. I think this is probably the strongest and most vivid articulation of the passivity of Christianity. If you go back to Nietzsche's quote, he thinks that this is inherent to Christianity, not just some weird byproduct. This is ingrained in its very nature, and it's probably why he didn't identify as a Christian. The inherent lack of aggression and passivity in Christianity has not been unchallenged, though. Paul Gondreu, I probably pronounced that wrong, points 5 explicit mentions of Jesus' anger and at least 25 implicit mentions of Jesus' anger and frustration or indignation in the Bible. In fact, he says that, quote, The Gospels testify more to Jesus' anger than any other emotion. So it seems a bit more complicated than Jesus not wanting us to be aggressive. Jesus also doesn't want us to just stay in the same place pretending that's some sort of virtue. For proof of that, we can go to the parable of the talents. In that parable, Jesus tells a tale of a master who gave one servant 5 talents, another 2 talents, and the last one 1 talent. The servant who was given 5 talents doubled his talents. The servant who was given 2 talents also doubled his talents. The servant who was given 1 talent just dug his up. When confronted by their master later on, those who sought to multiply their talents were praised and even called good and faithful servants. The servant who dug up his talent out of fear was scorned by his master. Jesus doesn't want us to stay in the same place and never fight to move forward and become stronger. Jesus never saw being weak and not working towards and striving to be your best as a virtue. He calls us to be strong and fight for his truth and work towards being our best and to not be afraid of conflict and challenging the status quo. Upon further examination, it actually may seem like Jesus is constantly teaching the opposite of slave morality. Now, let's not get ahead of ourselves. I don't want to paint the picture that Christianity has no elements of slave morality. Sometimes you are called to forgive instead of punish. Sometimes you are called to be generous instead of wealthy. Jesus dying on the cross could be seen as the quintessential example of slave morality. He could have stopped himself from dying, but he didn't. He essentially said, "Forgive them, Father. They have no idea what they're doing." Anyway, Jesus told God to forgive them instead of punish them. But there's something important to note about this situation. While Jesus could have sent angels to save him, he didn't. Slaves had no power and masked that as virtue. Jesus had power but chose not to use it. It seems as though Nietzsche failed to consider the idea that someone could have power and yet choose to exercise it in a loving way. Nietzsche would likely think something like chastity is a form of slave morality, and that people who are unable to find a mate mask that insecurity by calling purity a virtue. I will agree that there's nothing virtuous about such a failure of not attracting a mate, but if you are capable of doing so and are able to forego lust in favor of a higher virtue, you have achieved a higher level of strength than finding a mate is in and of itself. In my opinion, I think the highest order of virtue isn't avoiding evil, but having the choice between good and evil and choosing good. Another problem with Nietzsche's critique is that, for example, it assumes that being wealthy is good in and of itself. It's quite clear that this isn't the case. Overly wealthy people oftentimes have worse mental health, and it's actually the moderately wealthy people that end up being the happiest. The people who make just enough money to where they don't need to worry about their immediate needs anymore. For more proof, just look at some lottery winners and how money had ruined their lives. Indeed, it seems as though no matter which way you slice it, you need virtue and discipline in your life. Look at that. That will always be more important than any material good we can possess exercising master morality. Jesus dying and choosing mercy for those who stood against him wasn't Jesus being weak, but it was actually an act of impossible strength. This may be what Christ meant when he said the meek will inherit the earth. Meek meant something different in that era. According to Aristotle, the meek person is the one who feels anger on the right grounds, against the right person, in the right manner, at the right moment, at the right time. Meekness is strength contained, is why the Bible describes Moses as a meek man in Numbers, even after he stood against Pharaoh and argued with God and led the Israelites into wilderness for 40 years. This was the understanding of meekness at the time. Meekness, as a reminder, is to exercise no more power than necessary and to contain and control that power, but that implies that you actually have power to use to begin with. Even still, I can see that someone may say that to have power and exercise it righteously is still a form of slave morality, and if that's your argument, then sure. But if that's the case, then I don't think that slave morality is always a bad thing. As alluded to before, Christians don't really see the necessity of excessive material good. At the end of the day, we don't live for this world, we're living for another world. Therefore, giving into earthly passions when it distracts you from what's more important isn't a good idea. There's no getting around this. In a literal sense, the Bible speaks a lot about whether you're a slave or a master and how there's power to both of them. And by the way, slavery in the Bible is closer to servitude as we would understand it today. In Avatar: The Last Airbender, there's a wise old character by the name of Iroh. He was born into royalty. He was born heir to the throne and was meant to be the man to take all the glory and finally conclude this near century-long war. A series of events happens. I don't have time to get into it, I've talked about it before if you're interested. But essentially he gets demoted from military leader, who was heir to the throne, down to a peasant begging for money. Despite all of this, he stays strong and never sees his situation as hopeless. He understands that whether you're royalty or a commoner, that there's joy and fulfillment in life either way. Bringing it back to Vinland Saga, Canut's demeanor earlier in the season is, ironically, not an accurate example of how a Christian leader ought to be. There are many wars in the Bible, lots of violence. A good portion of them aren't outright condemned. This isn't to say that the Bible prescribes violence, it's just to say that it recognizes it as a fact of the time period. A similar enough time period to what we see in Vinland Saga. It's also often just describing events that happened, there was killing throughout history. And truly, thank God, we don't live in these times anymore. Canute should have been a strong, decisive leader who understands that violence is in his culture and is a reality, although it should be mitigated when possible. Not to stand in silence and anxiety. Moses, David, Joshua, and many other kings were strong, decisive leaders. They weren't pusillanimous and afraid. For men who still have this inclination to be aggressive, like say Thorkel, and for the good of society in general to teach men to be assertive and sometimes aggressive, that's what sports are for. They provide a safe and healthy outlet for these values to flourish safely and for no one to die. I talk about this much more in my upcoming book, Muscular Christianity. You can order it right now with the link in the description below. It's an amazing book that contains my workout philosophy and even my workout program. But don't just take my word for it, take it from the 10+ 5-star reviews. One reviewer says, "Reading Muscular Christianity was a rewarding experience. While very eloquent, it's also easy to follow. Paul Apone delivers every point with perfect depth and detail, while avoiding the empty fluff that so many writers are prone to use." Another says the content perfectly hits the mark for the missing spirituality and masculinity our generation needs. The last one I'll share here says, "The book wastes no time and goes right into the meat from the very get-go." Not only is the book full of interesting and actionable content, it is delivered in a way that makes it feel hard-hitting and punchy. The actual process of reading the book was so enjoyable that I barely put it down and finished reading it in the first 2 days after I got it. If any of this intrigues you, I'm holding a giveaway where you can actually get the book and some merchandise for free. More info on that at the end of the video. Anyways, this is actually what leads Canute to question the legitimacy of his Christian God. He believes this God isn't fit for the world he has inhabited. He even states that he would create his own paradise here on earth, as it would be impossible for us to find paradise if we endure his trials. His being God. He doesn't want us to be a slave to God. He wants us to blaze our own trail. Ask Lad even says, everyone is a slave to something. Ironically, this idea is echoed in the Bible in Romans chapter 6. Whatever you constantly think about and whatever you constantly practice will then become how you live. Askeladd was a slave to his past and to his nationality, and Thorfinn was a slave to revenge. Will you succumb and become a slave to your desires, or will you transcend that and become a slave to righteousness? Thors had the right idea. He was born a warrior, excelled as a warrior, but understood that war and violence weren't the greatest good. He abandoned his Viking life for a modest, peaceful life. In the Viking culture, violence was glorified, and for Thors, the greatest of them all, to reject that calling is diametrically opposed to everything they stood for. He understood modest and intimate things to ultimately be more important. He only reluctantly goes to fight later on because he needs to protect his family and understands there's no other option. This falls in line with Christian, or at least Catholic, teachings as well. St. Augustine outlined what is dubbed the just war theory. In it, he states that war is justified and could in fact be a good thing if it meets the following criteria. The criteria being that the war is for a just cause, the war is for the right intention, the war is from a legitimate authority, the war's outcome will be a superior situation than if it never happened, and the war is a last resort. It's surprising how much Thors and Canute resonate with these ideas despite, in the latter's case, rejecting Christianity. The more he agrees with this, the more he seems to reject Christianity. With this in mind, I think it would have made a lot of sense if Canute actually became more Christian as he developed. Thors dies in an ambush. He was ultimately taken out in battle, but there was always still love for his son all the way through. Canute, notably, doesn't believe man has the capacity for true love. He says as much. This is probably one part where I actually disagree with the show. Love is discriminatory in the sense that people have different priorities. A father loves and protects his family more than a random stranger. Such has to be the case, or else he would never provide for them. This reminds me of a psychological term called compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue is a phenomenon describing how we've dulled our compassion towards suffering. There's millions of terrible things going on in the world, and we're all connected to all of them due to our cell phones. But we can't care about all of them, and more importantly, we aren't designed to care about all of them. We're designed to care about our family, our community, and our country. So that's why we have to be discriminatory in that sense. As humans, we're only really capable of being heavily emotionally invested in a very small number of things. This is not to say that we cannot recognize things that are bad. It's just to say that we cannot be distraught and disheartened by every bad thing that happens in the world. And I mean cannot, as in literally cannot do it. So, we either have to discriminately choose the bottle of things that we can care for, or we can be like Canute and care for nothing. The choice is yours. So, bringing it back to Vinland Saga, we have a limited bottle as to how much love and sympathy we can give out at a time. Canute understands this and eventually decides that death is the only way we can actually find true love. Because only in death do we lose all feelings and priorities. A snowball has much more love than you or I because it has no one to prioritize over the other. This, however, isn't love. It's nothing at all. Just amoral, amorphous substance. Sure, it doesn't intentionally hurt anyone, but it also doesn't have the choice to love anyone. Love is a sacrifice and a choice. Love is the foregoing of effort or life or something else of value to achieve a higher good for someone else. If such is true, why do we place a special care on our kin or close friends or our community the way Canute criticizes? The Bible does tell us to love everyone, so why do we place a special care on those close to us? Jesus didn't die on the cross for some people more than other people, after all. The reason I think we do is because, well, obviously there's an emotional connection we have to them, and then there is, well, at least in my opinion, because we understand and we uniquely are best able to provide and nurture those close to us, and we want them to realize their potential. A father places special care over their child, and a king has special care over his kingdom, not only because there's an emotional connection, but because they are the best fit for that task. No one knows the child better than their parents because they, in a way, are their child. They actually live vicariously through them via genetics. They will understand them best. A duly appointed king understands how to best govern his people because they meet the requirements the people have agreed to. That's just how I see it anyways. This is just my own personal take from the series drawing on my own insights and understanding of Christian morality. So, this brings us all to the giveaway I was talking about. I'm going to be giving out 3 copies of my book. The 3 winners of the giveaway will also be able to get anything from my merch store for free. So that's 3 books and 3 merch items being given away. Click the link in the description to enter the contest. These specific designs were made by my friend, Dutch Matrix. Link to his Twitter down below. His commissions are generally open. You gotta be subscribed to my YouTube channels, and then there's some other things that you can do to get more points that increase your chance of winning the giveaway. My book comes with a workout program, so worst case scenario, you win a free workout program and some merch. There's no reason not to enter. The giveaway will be ending December 16th. Alright, I wish you all best of luck. Peace.